How was the great American writer Washington Irving influenced by the borders? Join me in this video where I'll be telling you his story of how he came to England and then Scotland, how he encountered myths and legends along the way and made a lifelong friend.
Washington Irving was a veteran of the War of 1812. He saw no real action, and the most exciting thing he did was a reconnaissance mission in the Great Lakes region. But the war had been disastrous for many American merchants, including Irving's family, so he left the US for England in mid-1815. Irving had been a minor celebrity back home, having published A History of New York in 1809. But that was years ago now, and fame is fleeting. He was also very much in need of money. His brother Peter had a shipping business in Liverpool that was failing, so Washington was determined to help. He aimed to make money through his writing as he'd done so in the past, but the ideas just weren't coming. A friend of his gave him a letter of introduction to Walter Scott, though, who had mentioned that he'd been a fan of Irving's History of New York. Irving headed north to the borders in 1817 to make his acquaintance, if Scott would receive him.
But Walter Scott was not yet Sir Walter Scott. He hadn't written Ivanhoe or Rob Roy. He was a romantic poet, and Irving loved him for this work. On August the 30th, Irving went to Abbotsford with his letter of introduction in his hand, hoping to meet Scott. And they say that you should never meet your heroes, but Irving fancied trying his luck.
And Irving was most definitely not disappointed. He wrote in a letter to his brother,
"The glorious old minstrel himself came limping to the gate and took me by the hand in a way that made me feel as if we were old friends."
Scott enthusiastically invites him in. He introduces him to his family, he gives him breakfast, he shows him some drafts of Rob Roy which would be published in December of that year. And he also shows him the local area, and one of the places that Scott decides to show Washington is this place. It's called Cauldshiels Loch, just south of Abbotsford, and just below Cauldshiels there you can see. And while the two men were here, Scott decided to tell Washington Irving a story, a local legend, about a water bull that lived in the loch.
The most interesting circumstance connected with it, however, according to Scott, was that it was haunted by a bogle in the shape of a water bull, which lived in the deep parts, and now and then came forth upon dry land and made a tremendous roaring that shook the very hills. This story had been current in the vicinity from time immemorial. There was a man living who declared he had seen the bull, and he was believed by many of his simple neighbors.
Water bulls are very interesting in Scottish folklore, known in Gaelic as Tarv Ishkas. They're mostly found in the Highlands, so it's really uncommon to find a story of a water bull in a place like this, in the borders. They're very similar to the water horse, or the kelpie. Very common in Scottish folklore, everyone's heard of water horses. But Tarv Ishkas are a lot less dangerous. They only emerge from the loch at night, so we're quite safe at the minute. And they'll come ashore and they'll look for nearby cows to breed with. It just so happens that we saw a herd of cows across from the other side of the loch, so I wonder if they've been paid a visit at some point. But they leave offspring, and you can tell the offspring due to a deformity in their ears. Usually the ears are exceptionally small, or they're split down the middle, and that's how you can tell that it's been fathered by a Tarv Ishka. I remember my first ever encounter when reading about water bulls in folklore was in a book of Manx folklore, that is the Isle of Man. Over there they're called Taru Ushtis, if I remember correctly. And the Taru Ushtis are a lot more nightmarish, and so too are their offspring. When they come ashore and they find a cow, the cow that they breed with dies, and the resulting baby is a horrid pile of skin and flesh with no bones. So Tarv Ishkas are a lot more wholesome, for want of a better word.
It's hard to tell what Scott thought about the supernatural at times. He wasn't exactly consistent in the attitude that he took. Some accounts from him make him out to be a true believer in otherworldly beings, and others seem to really highlight his skepticism. That skeptic side really did clash with his romantic side, but he regarded folklore as a deeply important part of the landscape. In regards to the water bull story, Scott said, "I don't choose to contradict the tale, for I am willing to have my lake stocked with any fish, flesh or fowl that my neighbours think proper to put into it. and these old wives' fables are a kind of property in Scotland that belong to the estates and go with the soil.
There's no doubt that this trip changed Washington Irving. It made him a better man. There was one story he liked telling people from his trip here, where him and Scott are walking out across the moors and it starts raining really heavily. And Scott takes his cape and he puts it over Washington to keep him dry from the rain. Scott took him under his wing, literally and figuratively, almost like a father figure. Washington got back his inspiration. He was going to be a writer or nothing at all. That's how he was going to make his living. He embraced his destiny, essentially. And it was thanks to Scott, it was thanks to this land which inspired him. It wasn't long before he'd write Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow and really earn him the fame that he enjoys today. Both men would go on to achieve a lot of fame and become the household names that they are today. But neither of them would forget the summer they spent together in 1817, how quickly they'd become friends, and it was a friendship that they relied upon for many years to come.
I cannot tell how truly I have enjoyed the hours I have passed here. They fly by too quick, yet each is loaded with story, incident, or song. And when I consider the world of ideas, images, and impressions that have been crowded upon my mind since I have been here, it seems incredible that I should only have been 2 days at Abbotsford. I have rambled about the hills with Scott, and have been in a kind of dream or delirium.
When Washington went back to America, he continued to take inspiration from his trip to the borders. His home in New York State, Sunnyside, was named after a farm on the Abbotsford estate, and it's enveloped in ivy from an original cutting brought from Melrose Abbey. Irving would always maintain his admiration for Scott, saying that he was the life of all company, all hanging on his lips, everybody making way for his anecdote or story. And Scott was also very impressed with Washington and spoke very highly of him. He wrote that the man who provided Irving's letter of introduction deserved his gratitude. Tell him, with my best love, that I have to thank him for making me known to Mr. Washington Irving, who is one of the best and pleasantest acquaintances I have made this many a day.
So I think I found the perfect spot for my cup of tea, and what a great location it is. I was just having to think about where Walter Scott and Washington Irving sat when they were looking out over this loch, and I like to think that it was right here, where I'm sat now. It's so peaceful here. I can hear the slow boiling of the kettle, the birds singing, there's the distant cow mooing behind me, and there is a faint noise of the traffic in the far distance, but it's probably almost as peaceful now as it was back in 1817. I was just thinking that I'll definitely have to go and visit Abbotsford and show you Abbotsford, because what a beautiful house that is. The exterior is magnificent, and inside there's so many different curiosities that Scott collected. Lots of famous people stayed there and visited Scott in his home, including other Americans like Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America. Even I stayed there myself about 5 years ago now. I stayed for a week. Fantastic memories there. I do feel deeply inspired and moved when I go to the locations that were important to Walter Scott. I am a big fan of his, and be it Abbotsford or Smailham Tower or here, when I go to the places that meant something to him, I can really understand how he was inspired and how he did feel that deep sense of attachment to the land. There are so many stories embedded in the soil, and I think Walter Scott understood that better than most people. And I can really appreciate it and respect him for it. As I say, I stayed at Abbotsford about 5 years ago now, and it's so close to here, but I never visited this loch when I came. I never even heard about it until I read the story written down by Washington Irving. And I like this story of the water bull. It's nice. There's not much detail about it, but it is interesting that that is what the local people believed for a long time. And we wouldn't have this story if it wasn't for Washington. And Washington wouldn't have the story if it wasn't for Scott telling it to him. So I do feel like Walter Scott is here in spirit with us. And it's him telling this story, not so much me. I know that doesn't really make sense, but it's kind of how I feel. I feel that his spirit is definitely in the soil of these fantastic border locations.
These videos are made possible by the support of my patrons, a great bunch of men and women. Thanks to my two latest patrons, Kate and the Wessex Nomad, and much appreciation to Mark Time, who provided his voice for the quotes of Washington Irving. If you'd like to become a patron and support this channel, you'll have early access to some videos. You'll be able to take part in some prize giveaways, and starting soon, the occasional exclusive video.